What Hitler said when 1,200 German officers were accused of plotting to kill him. The conference room at the Wolf's Lair reeked of sweat and smoke on the morning of July the 25th, 1944. 5 days had passed since the bomb exploded beneath the map table. 5 days since Claus von Stauffenberg's briefcase detonated and sent splinters of wood and metal through 4 men's bodies, while Adolf Hitler walked away with singed hair and a ringing in his ears that would not stop. Now, in this cramped, overheated room, deep in the East Prussian forest, Hitler stood at the head of the table, his right arm trembling uncontrollably. The tremor had worsened since the blast. His eyes, bloodshot and wild, swept across the faces of the men before him: Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, chief of the Reich Security Main Office, and a cluster of uniformed officers whose expressions ranged from rigid fear to barely concealed terror. On the table between them lay folders, dozens of folders. Each one contained a name. Each name belonged to a German officer, and with every passing hour, the pile grew higher. 1,000, Hitler said, his voice hoarse but cutting. Kaltenbrunner tells me the number may exceed 1,000. The room held its breath. Hitler's left hand slammed down on the nearest folder, making everyone flinch. 1,000 officers of the Wehrmacht, 1,000 men who swore an oath to me, who wore the uniform of the Reich, who plotted. His voice cracked, and he coughed violently. When he recovered, his face had gone red. Who plotted to murder their Führer while the enemies of Germany stand at our gates? Himmler, bespectacled and pale, nodded slowly. The investigation continues to reveal connections, my Führer. The conspiracy was far more extensive than we initially believed. Hitler turned to face the window, staring out at the birch trees swaying in the summer wind. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he spoke. They will pay, every single one of them. We will hang them on piano wire and film it so that I can watch them die like the traitors they are. The question that would haunt Germany for the remainder of the war had just been answered. How far would the purge go? How many would die? And what would Hitler say when confronted with the magnitude of betrayal within his own officer corps? The answer was unfolding in real time, and it would consume the Wehrmacht from within. To understand the fury that gripped Hitler in those final days of July 1944, you had to go back 5 days, back to the moment when everything should have ended, but didn't. July the 20th began like any other oppressive summer day at the Wolf's Lair. The air was thick with humidity and the constant drone of flies. Inside the conference barracks, Hitler hunched over maps of the Eastern Front, listening to reports of Soviet advances that grew worse by the week. The Red Army had shattered Army Group Center. Entire divisions were evaporating. The front line was collapsing. At 12:42 p.m., Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, tall, aristocratic, missing an eye and most of his right hand from wounds sustained in North Africa, excused himself from the briefing. He left his leather briefcase beneath the heavy oak table, less than 6 feet from where Hitler stood. The briefcase contained 2 pounds of British-made plastic explosives. Stauffenberg walked outside, his heart hammering, and waited near a communications bunker with his aide, Werner von Heften. At 12:42 p.m., the world turned white. The explosion ripped through the conference barracks with a deafening crack that echoed across the compound. Smoke billowed from the shattered windows. Stauffenberg, certain that no one inside could have survived, hurried to his staff car and raced toward the airfield. By 1:15 p.m. he was airborne, flying back to Berlin where the coup was scheduled to begin. But Hitler was not dead. The heavy oak table had shielded him from the worst of the blast. 4 men died: stenographer Heinrich Berger, General Günther Korten, Colonel Heinz Brandt, and General Rudolf Schmundt. But Hitler staggered out of the wreckage with burst eardrums, a sprained back, and a fury that would not abate. By 1:00 p.m. the first arrests began. By 4:00 p.m. the coup in Berlin had collapsed. Stauffenberg and 3 co-conspirators were executed by firing squad in the courtyard of the Bendler block that same night, their bodies illuminated by the headlights of military trucks. But Hitler knew this was just the beginning. As he sat in his personal quarters that evening, wrapped in blankets despite the summer heat, he told his personal physician, Theodor Morell, this was not the work of one man. This was a conspiracy of the aristocracy, of the general staff, of everyone who has ever doubted me. Morell, cautious and exhausted, said nothing. Over the following 72 hours, the Gestapo worked without sleep. They arrested General Friedrich Fromm, who had ordered Stauffenberg's execution to cover his own complicity. They arrested Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, who was supposed to become commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht in the new regime. They arrested General Ludwig Beck, who had attempted suicide twice in his office before a sergeant was ordered to finish the job with a gunshot to the head. And with each arrest came names, lists, connections, letters, diaries. By July the 24th, Himmler had compiled a preliminary report. Approximately 200 officers were directly involved in the plot. But the investigation was expanding. Every interrogation led to 5 more names. Every confession implicated 10 more men. Some were guilty, some were tangentially connected, some had merely expressed doubts about the war. It no longer mattered. Hitler's paranoia had metastasized into a conviction that the entire Wehrmacht officer corps was rotten to the core. And now, on the morning of July the 25th, the number had reached 1,000. The meeting at the Wolf's Lair stretched into the afternoon. Hitler paced the length of the room, his trembling arm tucked behind his back, while Kaltenbrunner read from his reports in a flat, bureaucratic monotone. General Karl Heinrich von Stauffenberg, military governor of France, attempted suicide by shooting himself in the head. He survived, but is blind. Under interrogation, he has implicated 43 officers in the Paris command structure. Hitler stopped pacing. Blind, he repeated. Good, he will hang blind. Kaltenbrunner turned the page. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, former head of the Abwehr. We have evidence of prior knowledge and possible involvement in planning. Canaris, Hitler spat the name like poison. That old fox, I should have known. Arrest him, strip him of everything. The list continued. General Erich Höppner, Colonel Albrecht Merz von Quernheim, Major Hans Ulrich von Oertzen, who blew himself up with a grenade rather than face arrest, General Friedrich Olbricht, shot alongside Stauffenberg, Colonel Georg Hansen, Captain Ludwig Gehre. Each name was met with the same response. Arrest, interrogate, execute. But then Kaltenbrunner paused. My Führer, there is a complication. Hitler turned sharply. What complication? Many of the names emerging from the investigation are connected to ongoing operations, active commanders, division leaders currently engaged against the Soviets. If we arrest them all immediately, it could destabilize. Destabilize? Hitler's voice rose to a shriek. The Wehrmacht is already destabilized. It is infested with traitors. You tell me we should leave them in command while they plot my murder? Himmler, ever careful, interjected. My Führer, Kaltenbrunner, is merely suggesting a strategic sequence of arrests. Priority targets first. The others can be monitored and taken when operationally feasible. Hitler glared at him. For a moment the room seemed to contract. Then Hitler spoke, his voice ice-cold. I want them all. I don't care if it takes a month or a year. Every officer whose name appears in these files will stand trial, every single one, and they will die. He turned back to the window, his breath coming in short-labored gasps. Freisler, he said suddenly. Roland Freisler. He will conduct the trials. He understands what is needed. Himmler nodded. Roland Freisler, president of the People's Court, was notorious for his theatrical, screaming courtroom performances. He treated defendants like vermin, shouting them down, humiliating them, ensuring that even the facade of judicial process was soaked in venom. Public trials, Hitler continued. Filmed, broadcast. I want the entire nation to see what happens to traitors. Kaltenbrunner made a note. And the method of execution? Hitler's lips twisted into something that might have been a smile. Piano wire, hung from meat hooks. Slowly, I want to watch them strangle. The room remained silent. Outside, the sound of birds could be heard, incongruously cheerful against the darkness pooling inside the conference room. By August the 1st, the scale of the arrests had become impossible to hide. Across Germany, officers vanished from their posts. Some were taken in the middle of the night. Others were arrested at command meetings led away by Gestapo agents while their colleagues watched in stunned silence. In Berlin, the cellars of Gestapo headquarters on Prince Albrechtstrasse became overcrowded with prisoners. Men in torn uniforms, some still wearing their iron crosses, sat on cold concrete floors and waited. Some were interrogated immediately, sessions that lasted 12, 16, 20 hours. Others waited days before anyone spoke to them. Lieutenant Fabian von Schlabrendorf, who had attempted to blow up Hitler with a bomb disguised as a bottle of brandy in 1943, found himself in a cell barely large enough to lie down in. The walls were slick with moisture. The smell of urine and fear was overpowering. Through the thin walls, he could hear the screams of other prisoners being tortured. In his memoir, written years later, Schlabrendorf recalled thinking, I understood then that this was not an investigation. It was an extermination. The trials began on August 7, 1944, in the main hall of the People's Court. Freisler presided, dressed in blood-red robes, his face contorted in perpetual rage. The first defendants were Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben and 7 others. Witzleben, once one of the most decorated officers in the Wehrmacht, was brought into the courtroom with his belt and suspenders confiscated. His pants sagged around his hips. He had to hold them up with his hands, a deliberate humiliation. Freisler leaned forward, jabbing his finger toward Witzleben. You miserable traitor, you who wore the uniform of Germany, you dare to stand before this court? Witzleben, grey-haired and exhausted, attempted to speak. "I acted according to my conscience." "Conscience!" Freisler shrieked, cutting him off. "You have no conscience! You are filth! You are nothing!" The courtroom erupted in orchestrated jeers. The proceeding lasted less than 3 hours. All 8 defendants were sentenced to death. That same afternoon, they were taken to Plötzensee prison in Berlin. Inside a small execution chamber painted in clinical white, meat hooks had been installed on a rail near the ceiling. Piano wire nooses hung ready. One by one, the condemned men were brought in. The executioners worked quickly. The wire was looped around the neck, and the prisoner was hoisted up by a hand-cranked pulley. Death was slow. 10-15 minutes of strangulation. A camera filmed everything. Hitler watched the footage later that evening in his private screening room at the Wolf's Lair. According to Albert Speer, who was present, Hitler sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the screen. When it ended, he simply said, "Again." By mid-August, the number of arrests had climbed past 700. By September, it exceeded 1,000. The Gestapo's definition of complicity became absurdly broad. Men who had shared a drink with Stauffenberg years earlier were arrested. Officers who had criticized the war privately in letters to their wives were arrested. Anyone connected to the old Prussian aristocracy was suspect. The younger officers watched in horror. Lieutenant Axel von dem Busche, who had volunteered for his own suicide bombing mission against Hitler in 1943 but was thwarted by circumstance, went into hiding. He later wrote, "We realized that the regime's final act would be to devour itself. Hitler would rather destroy the Wehrmacht than admit that his officers had lost faith in him." In the field, the impact was immediate. At a time when the Wehrmacht desperately needed cohesion, the purge fractured the command structure. Officers became paranoid, unwilling to speak candidly, even in secure briefings. The bonds of trust that held military units together began to erode. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces exploited the chaos. In France, the Western Allies broke out of Normandy and raced across the countryside, while German commanders, fearful of making independent decisions lest they be accused of disloyalty, waited for orders from Berlin that often never came. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was also implicated. Though his involvement in the plot was indirect, he had known of it but not participated, his name appeared in interrogation reports. On October 14, 1944, 2 generals arrived at his home in Herrlingen. They gave him a choice: stand trial and face certain execution, along with reprisals against his family, or commit suicide and be given a state funeral. Rommel chose the cyanide capsule. His death was announced as a result of injuries from an earlier strafing attack. He was buried with full military honors. Hitler sent a wreath. By the end of 1944, the People's Court had tried nearly 200 defendants connected to the July 20th plot. Over 5,000 people had been arrested in total, though not all were charged. The trials continued into early 1945, even as Soviet artillery could be heard in the distance. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the former spy master, was held for months in solitary confinement before being transferred to Flossenbürg concentration camp. On April 9, 1945, less than a month before Germany's surrender, he was hanged on Hitler's personal orders. His body was left hanging for hours as a final insult. In total, historians estimate that approximately 4,980 people were executed in connection with the July 20th plot and its aftermath. The actual number who were genuinely involved in planning the assassination was likely fewer than 200. But what did it reveal about Hitler, about the Nazi regime in its final, convulsive year? It revealed, first and foremost, that Hitler's worldview had always been built on paranoia. He believed himself surrounded by enemies, external and internal. The July 20th bomb simply confirmed what he had always suspected, that the old guard, the aristocratic Prussian officer class, had never truly accepted him. They had used him, he thought, used him to rebuild Germany's military might, and now they sought to discard him. He was not entirely wrong. Many of the conspirators were motivated by a desire to save Germany, not from Hitler's ideology, but from the military catastrophe his leadership had brought. They saw the writing on the wall. The war was lost. Hitler's refusal to accept reality would lead to the total destruction of Germany. If he could be removed, perhaps a negotiated peace was possible. Perhaps the worst could be avoided. But Hitler was incapable of such pragmatism. To him, betrayal was the ultimate sin. And the scope of the conspiracy, real and imagined, vindicated his belief that only he could be trusted. That everyone else was weak, cowardly, treasonous. The purge, then, was not just about punishment. It was about reasserting control, about sending a message to anyone who might harbor doubts. There is no escape. There is no mercy. There is only loyalty unto death. And yet in destroying the officer corps so thoroughly, Hitler accelerated Germany's collapse. competent commanders were executed or sidelined, the chain of command became paralyzed by fear. Soldiers in the field, already demoralized by constant retreat, lost faith in their leadership. The July 20th plot and its aftermath became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The officers had plotted because they believed Hitler was leading Germany to ruin. Hitler's response ensured that ruin came faster and more completely than it might have otherwise. On the evening of February 3, 1945, Roland Freisler was conducting another trial at the People's Court in Berlin. The defendant was Fabian von Schlabrendorf, the same officer who had spent months in Gestapo custody. At 11:30 a.m., the air raid sirens wailed. American bombers were overhead. The trial was suspended, and everyone rushed to the bomb shelter. Everyone except Freisler, who stayed behind to gather his files. A bomb struck the building directly. The ceiling collapsed. Freisler was found dead beneath a wooden beam, still clutching the file folder containing Schlabrendorf's case documents. Schlabrendorf survived the bombing and, in the chaos of Berlin's final weeks, was transferred between prisons until he was eventually liberated by American forces in late April. He never stood trial. Years later, he wrote about the moment he learned of Freisler's death. He described feeling not joy, but a profound emptiness. "I thought of all the men who had stood where I stood," he wrote, "who had endured Freisler's screaming, his hatred, his cruelty, and I thought, what did any of it accomplish? What did all those deaths prevent? Nothing. The war continued, Germany burned, and in the end, we all lost." On the night of April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler sat in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Soviet soldiers were less than a mile away. The Reich he had promised would last 1,000 years was in its final hours. In his last will and testament, he wrote, "I die with a happy heart, aware of the immeasurable deeds and achievements of our soldiers at the front." He made no mention of the July 20th plot, no mention of the 200 officers whose names had appeared in Kaltenbrunner's folders, no mention of the men who had died on piano wire in Plötzensee prison. Perhaps in the end he had forgotten them, or perhaps he understood in some buried part of his mind that they had been right, that his leadership had always led to this: a bunker, a cyanide capsule, and the sound of Russian voices growing louder in the darkness.